The bucket tipped over before Mira could catch it, and dirty water spread fast across the marble floor of the council hall, right toward the feet of a man who had not said a single word since he walked in. Mira dropped to her knees at once, grabbing her cloth, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. She had exactly 4 minutes left to finish cleaning this hallway, before the council doors opened for the evening session, and now there was water everywhere, soaking into the stone, threatening to leave a mark that someone would notice and blame her for. "I am so sorry, sir," she said, not daring to look up. "I will have it dry in a moment." The man did not answer. He only stepped back, just enough to avoid the spreading water, and continued reading the papers in his hand, as if nothing had happened at all. His silence unsettled her, more than any scolding could have. She had worked in this building for almost a year, and she had learned that silence from men in fine coats was rarely a good sign. She wiped fast, her hands moving in practice circles, years of this work having taught her exactly how much pressure to use so the cloth would not squeak against the stone. Behind her, footsteps echoed down the long hallway, more council members arriving for the evening meeting, their voices low and serious, discussing something about grain prices and border taxes. None of them looked at her. She was used to that too. In this building, people like her were meant to be invisible, present only in the shine of the floors and the clean smell of the halls, never in conversation, never in thought. By the time she had the water wiped up and her supplies packed into her cart, the hallway was full of council members, walking toward the great chamber at the far end. She pressed herself against the wall to let them pass, keeping her eyes down, the way she had been taught to do from her very first day. "You there," a voice said. Mira froze. She looked up to see an older woman in a deep green coat, a woman she recognized as one of the senior council members, someone named Margaret Voss, known throughout the building for her sharp tongue and sharper eyes.
"Yes, madam,"
Mira said. "The east corridor. Has it been cleaned yet?" "Not yet, madam. I was told to finish here first." Margaret Voss studied her for a moment, the way someone studies a piece of furniture they are deciding whether to keep or replace. "See that it is done before the session ends. The visiting delegates will be walking through there tonight." "Yes, madam. Right away." The woman moved on without another word, and Mira let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. She grabbed the handle of her cart and began pushing it toward the east corridor, her arms already tired from a full day of work that had started before sunrise. This was her life now, 6 days a week, from before dawn until long after the sun went down. She cleaned the floors, the windows, the long tables in the meeting rooms, the brass handles on every door in this enormous building that housed the people who decided how everyone else in the region would live. She polished the very same halls where laws were written that affected farmers 3 days' journey away, where taxes were decided that would take food from tables she would never see, where wars had once been discussed and, thankfully, avoided. It had not always been this way for her. 2 years ago, Mira had been a different person entirely, a young woman with a small reputation in her home village for her singing voice. She used to sing at gatherings, at weddings, at the small harvest festival held every autumn beneath the old oak tree at the center of the village square. People had told her, more than once, that her voice was something special, something that could carry across a valley and still sound soft when it reached the other side. Then her father had fallen ill, and the debts had piled up faster than any harvest could pay them off, and within a single terrible season, everything had changed. Her mother had passed 2 winters before that, so there had been no one else to carry the weight of what came next. Mira had left her village at 17 years old, with nothing but a small bag and the promise of steady work in the city, cleaning for the council, in exchange for a place to sleep and enough coin to send home to her father, who now lived with her aunt in a small cottage on the edge of their village, too weak to work but, thankfully, still breathing. She did not sing anymore, not where anyone could hear her at least. In the beginning, she had tried, humming quietly while she worked, but a senior member of the cleaning staff had warned her early on that the council did not employ singers, they employed cleaners, and if she wanted to keep either title, she should decide quickly which one she was. So she had stopped, mostly, except for moments like this one, late in the evening, when the halls were empty and the council members were locked away behind heavy doors discussing matters far above her understanding, and the only sound in the entire building was the soft slide of her cloth against stone. She reached the east corridor and set down her cart, glancing up and down the empty hall to make sure she was truly alone. The corridor was long, lined with tall windows on one side that looked out over the city, its rooftops glowing orange in the last light of the evening sun. On the other side hung portraits of past council leaders, stern faces staring down at anyone who passed beneath them, as if judging whether that person deserved to walk these halls at all. Mira knelt down and began her work, and without quite meaning to, a small tune rose up from somewhere deep inside her chest. It was an old song, one her mother used to sing while working in their small kitchen back home, something about a river finding its way to the sea, no matter how many stones stood in its path. She hummed it first, barely above a whisper, and then, because the corridor truly seemed empty, and the evening felt strangely peaceful, she let a few actual words slip out. The sound of her own voice, after so long, felt strange in her throat, like an old coat she had not worn in years, but which still somehow fit. She kept working, the cloth moving in slow circles, her voice rising just slightly with each verse, filling the empty corridor with something warmer than the cold stone deserved. She thought of her mother's kitchen, of the smell of bread, of her father's laugh before he grew sick, of a life that felt very far away now but which lived on, somehow, in this small song. She did not notice the door at the end of the corridor open. She did not notice the man who stepped through it, the same man from earlier whose feet she had nearly soaked with dirty water, the man whose face had shown no expression at all through the entire incident. His name, though she did not yet know it, was Edmund Hale, and he was the head of the council, a position that made him one of the most powerful men in the entire region, a man known for his silence in meetings, and his refusal to show emotion of any kind, even when decisions he made affected thousands of lives. Edmund Hale had stepped out of the chamber for a moment of quiet, tired from hours of arguing over a trade agreement that 3 different factions could not agree on, each one convinced their version of fairness was the only correct one. He had walked into the east corridor meaning only to breathe for a moment before returning to the noise, and instead he had found this. A young woman, kneeling on the floor, singing softly to herself, completely unaware that anyone was listening. He stopped walking. He stood very still, several paces behind her, close enough to hear every word, but far enough that his presence had not yet been noticed. Something about the song struck him in a place he had not expected, a place he had thought was closed off long ago, sealed shut the way a person seals a door in a house they no longer wish to enter. The tune was old and simple, and it should not have meant anything to him at all, and yet, he remained where he was, not moving, not speaking, simply listening, as her voice filled the empty corridor with something the marble halls had not heard in a very long time. Mira, still unaware, continued her work, continued her song, the last light of evening, falling gold across the floor she cleaned, unaware that the most powerful man in the council stood behind her, and unaware that something inside him had gone very quiet and very still, in a way it had not gone in years. The corridor held its breath, though neither of them yet knew why. Down the hall, behind the heavy doors of the great chamber, the council continued its business without them, unaware that in a quiet corridor nearby, something had just begun that no meeting, no law, and no vote would ever be able to undo. Edmund did not move for a long moment. He stood in the shadow near the tall window, watching the young woman kneel over her work, her voice rising and falling, in a melody that felt older than the building around them. He was a man who had trained himself, over many years, to feel very little in public. It was a skill that had served him well, in a life spent negotiating with people who would use any sign of feeling against him. But here, alone in this corridor, with no one watching him watch her, he allowed himself something he rarely permitted, which was simply to listen. The song ended. Mira sat back on her heels, wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, and reached for her cloth again, ready to continue her work in silence as she always did. It was only then that she noticed, from the corner of her eye, a shadow that had not been there before. She turned her head, and her whole body went stiff. The man standing there was the same one from earlier, the one whose shoes she had nearly ruined with dirty water, only now she recognized him properly, because she had seen his portrait hanging near the entrance of the building, a formal painting meant to remind every visitor exactly who governed this hall. Edmund Hale, the head of the council, the man whose decisions shaped the lives of everyone in the region, including her own father, who depended on tax policies decided in rooms she was only ever allowed to clean, never to enter. "I am so sorry, sir," Mira said quickly, scrambling to her feet, her cloth falling from her hands. "I did not know anyone was there. I will be quiet. Please, I did not mean to disturb anyone." Edmund said nothing at first. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable, the same blankness she had noticed earlier, when the water had spilled near his shoes. For a moment, Mira was certain she would lose her position that very night, certain that a man of his standing would not tolerate a cleaner singing in his hallways, as if she owned them. "What was that song?" he asked finally. The question caught her off guard. She had expected anger, or at least a cold dismissal, not a question asked in a voice that sounded almost gentle, almost curious, though still guarded in a way she could not quite explain. "It is nothing, sir. Just an old song from my village. I did not mean to sing it here." "It will not happen again." "I did not ask whether it would happen again," he said. "I asked what it was." Mira hesitated, unsure how to answer a man whose title alone could end her employment with a single word to her supervisor. But something about the stillness in his face, the way his eyes had not left hers since she turned around, made her feel that honesty, at least in this moment, was the safer choice. "It is called the River Song, sir. My mother used to sing it while she worked. It is about a river that always finds its way to the sea, no matter how many stones try to block its path." Edmund's jaw tightened slightly, so slightly that anyone else might have missed it entirely. But Mira noticed, because she had spent a year of her life learning to read the smallest signals from powerful people, learning which glances meant danger and which meant nothing at all. "Where is your village?" he asked. "Ashwell, sir. 3 days east of the city, along the river valley." Something shifted behind his eyes at the mention of the name, though he said nothing further about it. Instead, he glanced down the corridor, toward the heavy doors of the great chamber, where the council session continued without him, the low murmur of voices still audible even from this distance. "You should return to your work," he said finally, his voice returning to the flat, controlled tone she had heard him use earlier that day. "The delegates will be walking through here soon." "Yes, sir, of course." He turned and walked back toward the chamber without another word, his footsteps steady and unhurried, and within moments, he had disappeared behind the heavy doors, leaving Mira alone in the corridor once more, her heart still pounding, though now for reasons that had nothing to do with fear of losing her position. She finished her work in silence after that, moving through the rest of the corridor with careful, quiet efficiency, no more songs escaping her lips. But her mind kept returning to the strange moment that had just passed. She had expected punishment. She had expected, at the very least, a cold word of warning. Instead, she had received questions, and something in his voice when he asked about the song had sounded almost like recognition, though she could not imagine what a man like Edmund Hale could possibly recognize in a simple tune her mother used to sing while kneading bread. She pushed the thought aside as best she could, and finished her shift, gathering her cart and heading toward the small room near the kitchens, where the cleaning staff kept their supplies overnight. The other workers were already there, tired from their own long days, exchanging brief tired greetings before heading to their separate lodgings, scattered throughout the poorer districts of the city. An older woman named Clara Whitfield, who had worked in the council building for over 20 years and had taken a quiet liking to Mira since her arrival, noticed the distracted look on her face as she stacked her supplies. "You seem far away tonight," Clara said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Did something happen?" Mira considered telling her about the encounter in the east corridor, but something made her hesitate. It felt too strange, too fragile, like something that might break if she spoke it aloud too soon. "Just a long day," she said instead. "That is all." Clara studied her for a moment longer, the way older women often study younger ones, when they suspect there is more to a story than what has been shared, but she did not press further. "Get some rest then. Tomorrow will be longer still. The delegates are staying for 3 more days, and the whole building must shine for them." Mira nodded and said her goodnights, then made her way out into the cool evening air, walking the familiar path toward the small rented room she shared with 2 other young women, who also worked in service throughout the city. The streets were quieter now, lit by scattered lanterns, the smell of evening cooking drifting from open windows as she passed. She thought again of the man's face in the corridor, the way his jaw had tightened at the mention of Ashwell, the way his voice had asked about the song, as though the answer mattered to him more than he wanted anyone to know. She did not understand it, and she told herself it did not matter, that a man like Edmund Hale would forget the entire encounter by morning, that she was foolish to give it any more thought than she would give a passing cloud. But somewhere deep inside her, a small and stubborn hope had already begun to take root, whether she wanted it to or not. Meanwhile, behind the heavy doors of the great chamber, Edmund Hale sat through the remainder of the evening session with his usual composed expression, offering measured responses to every question posed to him, his voice steady, his manner calm. No one in that room could have guessed that his thoughts kept drifting away from trade agreements and border taxes, back to a quiet corridor, and a song he had not heard in more than 15 years. A song that belonged to a woman he had once loved and lost, a woman whose memory he had buried so deeply that hearing it again, sung by a stranger's voice, had nearly broken through every wall he had built around himself since that loss. He said nothing about it to anyone. He simply sat and listened and waited for the session to end, his mind circling back again and again to a corridor, a song, and a young cleaner from a village called Ashwell, 3 days east along the river valley, a place he had not allowed himself to think about in a very long time. 3 days passed before Mira saw Edmund Hale again, and in that time she convinced herself, over and over, that the strange encounter in the East Corridor had meant nothing at all. Powerful men did not remember cleaners. They did not ask about songs because they cared about them. They asked because it was late, and they were tired, and perhaps for one brief moment, a familiar tune had simply crossed their path, the way a stray cat crosses a road, noticed and then forgotten. She told herself this every morning as she filled her bucket, and every evening as she emptied it, and by the third day she had almost managed to believe it. The visiting delegates were still in the building, and their presence had turned every hallway into a stage where appearances mattered more than usual. Mira had been assigned to the upper floor that week, cleaning the smaller meeting rooms where private negotiations took place between council members and the delegates from the Northern Territories. It was quieter work, away from the busy main corridors, though it came with its own particular kind of pressure, since any mistake made in these rooms would be noticed immediately by people whose opinions carried great weight. She was polishing the long table in the third meeting room when she heard voices approaching from the hallway outside. She recognized one of them immediately as belonging to Margaret Voss, the sharp-tongued council member who had spoken to her days earlier. "The Northern delegation is asking for concessions we cannot afford to give," Margaret was saying, her voice carrying easily through the half-open door. "If we allow their terms, the southern provinces will demand the same, and then where does that leave the Treasury?" "That is precisely why we must be careful how we present this," a second voice answered, calm and measured, and Mira's hands went still on the table the moment she recognized it. "Edmund Hale." "Careful will not satisfy them forever," Margaret said. "Sooner or later, a decision must be made, Edmund, and you cannot delay it by disappearing into corridors every time a conversation grows difficult." There was a brief pause before Edmund answered. "I do not disappear, Margaret, I think. There is a difference. The delegates leave in 4 days, and we still have no answer for them." Their footsteps continued past the door without either of them noticing Mira inside, and within moments, their voices faded down the hallway, swallowed by the general noise of the building. Mira let out a slow breath, unaware until that moment that she had been holding it. She had not meant to overhear anything, and she certainly had not meant for Margaret's words to catch in her mind the way they had. Disappearing into corridors every time a conversation grows difficult. Had that been what happened 3 nights ago? Had he simply wandered away from a difficult meeting and found her there entirely by accident, with no meaning behind it at all? She finished polishing the table and moved on to the next room, trying to push the thought away, though it clung to her more stubbornly than she would have liked. Later that afternoon, as the light outside began its slow shift toward evening, Mira was sent to deliver a stack of freshly pressed linens to the small private chamber used by senior council members between sessions. She had never been inside this particular room before, and she moved carefully, unsure exactly where everything belonged, setting the linens down on a side table near the window, as she had been instructed. The room was empty when she entered, or so she believed, until a voice spoke from a chair positioned near the far wall, half hidden by the angle of an open door. "You may leave those on the table," Edmund Hale said. Mira startled, nearly dropping the last of the linens. She turned to find him seated with a small stack of papers in his lap. though his eyes were not on the papers at all. They were on her. "I did not know anyone was in here, sir. I am sorry to have disturbed you." "You have not disturbed me." He set the papers aside and studied her for a long moment, the same unreadable expression from before settling over his face, though something in his eyes seemed less guarded than it had in the corridor. "How long have you worked in this building?" The question surprised her, though less than it might have 3 days earlier. "Almost a year now, sir." "And before that?" She hesitated, unsure why a man of his position would want to know anything about her life before she came to clean his floors. But his gaze remained steady, patient, waiting for an answer, rather than demanding one. And something about that patience made her willing to speak. "I lived in Ashwell, sir, with my mother and father. My mother passed 2 winters before I left. My father fell ill not long after, and there were debts. I came to the city to find steady work, so I could send money home to help care for him." Edmund was quiet for a moment, his fingers resting lightly on the arm of his chair. "And the song, the one you were singing that night, your mother taught it to you?" "Yes, sir. She sang it often while she worked. She said it reminded her of home, though she never told me exactly where that was. She came from somewhere along the river, further north than Ashwell, before she married my father." Something flickered across Edmund's face at this, quick and sharp, gone almost as soon as it appeared, though Mira caught the edge of it before it vanished. He rose from his chair and walked slowly to the window, looking out over the city rooftops, his back to her now, his shoulders set in a way that seemed heavier than it had a moment before. "What was your mother's name?" he asked, without turning around. "Ellen, sir. Ellen Bramwell, before she married." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Mira began to wonder if she had said something wrong, something that had offended him in a way she did not understand. But when Edmund finally turned back to face her, his expression had changed entirely from the composed mask he wore in every meeting she had ever glimpsed him in. For just a moment, standing there in the fading afternoon light, he looked less like the powerful head of the council, and more like a man who had just been handed a memory he had thought was lost forever. "Thank you for the linens," he said finally, his voice quieter than before, though carefully controlled once more. "You may return to your duties." Mira curtsied slightly, unsure what else to do, and left the room as quickly as she could without appearing to rush, her mind spinning with questions she did not dare ask aloud. Why had the mention of her mother's name affected him so deeply? What connection could a man like Edmund Hale possibly have to a woman who had spent her whole life in a small village along the river, a woman who had died 2 winters ago without ever once mentioning the name of the man who now sat, shaken, in a chamber high above the city she had left behind? That evening, as Mira walked home through the quiet streets, she found herself humming the river song again, without quite meaning to. Though this time, she stopped herself quickly, glancing around to make sure no one had heard. The song no longer felt like a simple memory of her mother's kitchen. It felt, now, like a thread connecting 2 lives that should never have crossed, pulling tighter with every passing day, though toward what end she could not begin to guess. Behind her, in the tall council building glowing with lantern light against the darkening sky, Edmund Hale remained in his private chamber long after the linens had been delivered, staring at a single faded portrait he kept locked away in a drawer of his desk, one he had not opened in over a decade, a portrait of a young woman with a voice that had once made an entire village stop and listen, a woman named Ellen, whose face bore a resemblance to Mira's that he had refused, until this very day, to let himself see. Edmund did not sleep well that night. He sat alone in his private chamber, long after the candles in the hallway had been extinguished, the small portrait resting on his desk in the dim light, its edges worn soft from years spent hidden away in the back of a locked drawer. He had not looked at this face in over 10 years. He had told himself, more times than he could count, that he had made peace with the past it represented, that he had built a life of purpose and duty on top of it, and that opening old wounds served no one, least of all himself. And yet here he was, staring at a young woman's painted eyes, feeling as though the last decade had simply folded in on itself. Her name had been Ellen Bramwell, and he had known her long before he became the man everyone in this building addressed with careful respect and quiet caution. He had been younger then, not yet burdened by the weight of a council seat, still a minor clerk working in the record halls, sent one summer to a small river village called Millhaven to help settle a boundary dispute between 2 farming families. It was there, in the square beneath an old oak tree, that he had first heard her sing at a village gathering, her voice carrying across the crowd with an ease that made every conversation around her fall silent. They had spent that summer together, stolen hours between his official duties, walking along the riverbank, talking about futures neither of them could have known would never come to pass. He had promised to return once his position in the city was secure enough to support a wife. She had promised to wait. But life, as it so often does, had other plans. His father had died suddenly that winter, forcing Edmund to take on responsibilities far beyond his years, responsibilities that kept him bound to the city for far longer than he had intended. Letters between them grew slower, then stopped altogether, lost somewhere between his mounting duties and her own family's troubles, which he only learned of much later, long after it was too late to matter. By the time he finally managed to travel back toward Millhaven, seeking her out after nearly 2 years of silence, he learned she had married a farmer from a neighboring village and moved away entirely, her family's debts forcing a decision that left no room for a young clerk's unfulfilled promises. He never saw her again. He never even learned where she had gone, only that she had gone, and that the life he might have had with her had closed like a door he no longer had the key to. He had buried the memory deep, the way a man buries anything too painful to carry through daily life, and over the years he had built himself into someone entirely different, someone known for cold composure rather than youthful longing, someone who negotiated treaties and settled disputes with a steady hand that betrayed nothing of what lay beneath it. Until 3 nights ago, when a cleaner's voice in an empty corridor had sung a song he remembered from a summer he had tried very hard to forget. Ellen Bramwell. The name Mira had spoken so plainly, so innocently, unaware of what it meant to the man standing before her. And now, sitting alone with the old portrait in his hands, Edmund allowed himself, for the first time in over a decade, to consider a possibility he had not dared to think until this very moment. Could Mira be Ellen's daughter? The timing fit. Mira's age, her mother's history along the river, the song itself, which Edmund now remembered clearly, as one Ellen used to hum while walking beside the water, claiming it had been passed down from her own mother before her, and the resemblance, now that he allowed himself to truly examine it in memory, was undeniable. The same dark eyes, the same quiet strength in her posture, even while performing the most humble of tasks. He had noticed it that first day, when the water had spilled near his feet, and she had knelt to clean it without a hint of resentment in her expression, only quiet determination. He set the portrait down and pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to steady the thoughts racing through his mind. If this was true, if Mira truly was Ellen's daughter, what did that mean for him now? What obligation did he owe to a woman he had loved and lost, through a daughter she likely knew nothing about him at all? He could not simply ask her outright. Such a question, coming from the head of the council to one of the cleaning staff, would raise more concern than clarity, and he had no wish to frighten her or draw unwanted attention to either of them. He would need to be careful, patient, the way he approached every difficult negotiation in his professional life, though this felt far more delicate than any treaty he had ever drafted. The next morning arrived with the usual business of the council chambers, delegates from the Northern Territories continuing their discussions over trade terms, Margaret Voss pressing him for decisions he was not yet ready to make. Edmund moved through his duties with his usual composed manner, giving no outward sign of the restless night behind him, though his mind remained, throughout every meeting, partly occupied with thoughts of a corridor, a song, and a young woman, whose presence in this building suddenly felt far less like coincidence than he had first assumed. During a brief pause between sessions, he found himself walking, without quite deciding to, toward the section of the building where the cleaning staff typically worked in the mornings. He told himself he was simply taking a walk to clear his head before the next round of negotiations, though some part of him knew this was not entirely true. He found Clara Whitfield instead, the older woman who oversaw much of the cleaning staff's daily assignments, sweeping the entrance hall with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this work for decades. "Good morning, sir," Clara said, straightening slightly when she noticed him approaching. "Is there something you require?" Edmund considered his words carefully. "I noticed one of your staff, a young woman, working in the East Corridor a few nights ago. I wish to ask after her welfare. The building can be demanding on new workers, and I want to ensure she is being treated fairly." Clara studied him for a moment, a flicker of curiosity crossing her weathered face, though she was far too experienced to voice whatever thoughts passed behind her eyes. "You must mean Mira, sir. She came to us about a year ago. From a village called Ashwell. Hard-working girl. Keeps to herself mostly, though she has a kind heart. Sends most of her wages home to care for her ailing father. And her mother? Edmund asked, keeping his voice as steady as he could manage. Passed some years back, from what I understand. The girl does not speak of it often. Grief sits heavy on some people, sir, and she seems the type to carry hers quietly rather than share it. Edmund nodded slowly, filing away this information alongside everything else he already suspected. Thank you, Clara. That will be all. He walked away before she could ask any further questions of her own, his mind now turning over a new problem entirely. He needed to know more, needed to understand the full truth of Mira's history before he allowed himself to consider what, if anything, he owed her because of it. But he also understood, with the same careful instinct that had guided his political career for years, that truth revealed carelessly could cause more harm than good, especially to a young woman who had already lost so much, and who had no idea that the man overseeing her workplace might be tied to her mother's past in ways that could unravel everything she believed about her own life. For now, he decided, he would watch, and wait, and learn what he could without frightening her away. But he also knew, deep down, that this quiet resolve would not hold for long. Some truths, once stirred, refused to settle back into silence, no matter how carefully a man tried to contain them. Word travels quickly, in a building full of people who have little else to do between formal duties than notice small things and whisper about them. By the end of that week, a few of the other cleaning staff had begun to notice that Edmund Hale seemed to find reasons to pass through certain corridors more often than his duties strictly required. Corridors that happened to coincide with wherever Mira had been assigned to work that day. Clara Whitfield noticed it first, though she said nothing to Mira directly, choosing instead to watch quietly and draw her own conclusions. She had worked in this building long enough to recognize the difference between a council leader simply moving through his own halls and a man who was, whether he admitted it to himself or not, looking for someone. Mira herself remained largely unaware of how often their paths had begun to cross, attributing each encounter to simple coincidence, the natural result of a large building where people inevitably passed one another throughout the day. She did notice, however, that Edmund Hale had begun speaking to her more frequently, brief exchanges that had nothing to do with council business, questions about her father's health, about life in Ashwell, about small details of her days that seemed, to her, oddly personal for a man in his position to care about. She found herself looking forward to these small conversations more than she wanted to admit, though she scolded herself regularly for the foolishness of it. A man like Edmund Hale did not become genuinely interested in a cleaner's daily life without reason, and she worried more than once that perhaps he was simply testing her, watching to see if she might slip and reveal some flaw that would give the council reason to dismiss her. It was easier, in some ways, to imagine suspicion than kindness, since kindness from someone so powerful felt like a thing too fragile and too strange to trust completely. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after their first encounter in the East Corridor, Mira was assigned to clean the small library used by council members for private research, a quiet room lined with tall shelves and a single large table positioned near a window overlooking the city. She worked methodically, dusting the shelves one by one, careful not to disturb the careful order of the books, many of which looked far older and more valuable than anything she had ever handled in her life. She was halfway through her task when Edmund appeared in the doorway, a small book tucked under one arm, his expression, as always, difficult to read at first glance. "I did not mean to interrupt," he said. "I only came for a book. Please, continue your work." "Of course, sir." Mira returned to her dusting, though she remained keenly aware of his presence as he moved toward one of the far shelves, searching briefly, before finding what he sought, and returning to stand near the window, instead of leaving immediately, as she had expected. "How is your father?" he asked, his eyes on the city outside, rather than on her. "Better this week, sir. Thank you for asking. My aunt writes that his cough has eased somewhat, though the healer still recommends rest above all else." "Good. I am glad to hear it." He paused, turning the small book over in his hands without opening it, as though needing something to occupy his fingers, while his mind worked through something more difficult to voice. "Mira, may I ask you something personal?" Her hands stilled on the shelf she had been dusting. "Of course, sir." "Your mother, Ellen. Did she ever speak of her life before Ashwell, before she married your father?" The question, though gently asked, sent a small jolt through Mira's chest. It was not the first time he had asked about her mother, but something in his tone this time felt different, heavier, as though the question mattered to him in a way that went beyond simple curiosity. Not often, sir. She kept much of her past to herself. I know she came from a village further north, along the same river, though she never told me its name. She used to say that some things were better left in the past, that dwelling on old sorrows only made new joys harder to feel. Edmund's jaw tightened slightly at this, and for a long moment he said nothing, staring out at the darkening sky over the rooftops. When he finally spoke again, his voice had grown quieter, more careful, as though he were choosing each word with great deliberation. Did she ever mention a name? Anyone from that village she might have known, before she came to Ashwell? Mira frowned slightly, trying to recall any fragment of conversation from her childhood that might answer his question, though her memories of her mother, while warm, were not always detailed in the ways he seemed to need. She spoke sometimes of a summer, sir, one she said had been the happiest of her life, before hardship came and changed everything. She never gave a name, though, only that it was a summer she often thought of, especially when she sang. Something in Edmund's composed expression cracked, just barely, a flicker of pain crossing his features before he managed to smooth it away again, though not quickly enough to escape Mira's notice entirely. "Sir, are you well?" she asked, setting down her cloth entirely now, concern overtaking her caution. "I am well," he said, though his voice betrayed the lie, even as he spoke it. He set the book down on the table, and turned to face her fully, for the first time since entering the room. "Mira, there is something I must tell you, though I confess, I have struggled with how best to say it, and whether it is even my place to say it at all." Mira's heart began to race, though she could not have said whether it was from fear or anticipation. "Sir, you may speak freely. I will not repeat anything you say." Edmund studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face, as though looking for something he was both hoping and dreading to find. "Many years ago, before I held any position of importance in this council, I traveled to a village called Millhaven, further north along the river from Ashwell, to settle a boundary dispute between two families. It was there that I met a young woman, whose voice, when she sang, could silence an entire village square." Mira's breath caught in her throat, though she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. Her name was Ellen Bramwell. The room fell utterly silent, the only sound the distant murmur of the city beyond the window, growing quieter as evening settled fully over the rooftops. "That was my mother's name, sir," Mira whispered, though of course he already knew this, had known it for 2 weeks now, carrying the weight of this knowledge alone, while trying to decide the right way to share it. "Before she married my father." "I know," Edmund said quietly. "I have known since the day you told me. I have spent every day since, trying to decide whether this truth was mine to share, and whether sharing it would bring you comfort, or only more confusion, to a life that has already carried more hardship than any young woman should have to bear." Mira's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the shelf beside her, steadying herself against a wave of emotion she could not fully name. "Sir, please, what are you saying? What was she to you?" Edmund closed his eyes briefly, as though gathering the courage to finally speak a truth he had carried silently for over a decade. "I loved your mother, Mira, long before either of us knew what our lives would become. We were meant to build a future together, though circumstances beyond either of our control tore that future apart before it could ever truly begin." Mira stood frozen, the weight of his words settling over her slowly, each one reshaping her understanding of a mother she had thought she knew completely, revealing instead a hidden chapter of her mother's life that had remained locked away for years, waiting, it seemed, for exactly this moment to finally come into the light. The silence between them stretched on for what felt like a very long time, filled only by the soft ticking of a clock somewhere in the library and the distant hum of the city settling into evening. Mira remained still, one hand pressed against the edge of the shelf, her mind struggling to hold together the pieces of a story that had suddenly grown far larger than the small quiet life she had always believed her mother had lived. "Why did she never speak of you?" Mira finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "If your love was as true as you say, why would she carry such a memory in silence, all the way until her passing, without ever giving it a name?" Edmund's shoulders sagged slightly. The composed posture he wore so carefully in every council meeting finally giving way to something more honest, more weary. I have asked myself that same question many times over these past 2 weeks, Mira, and I believe the answer lies in circumstances neither of us controlled. When I left Millhaven that summer, I promised to return once my position in the city allowed me to support a household of my own. I meant every word of that promise. But my father died suddenly that winter, and the responsibilities left in his absence consumed every hour of my life for nearly 2 years. Our letters slowed, and then stopped entirely, lost somewhere between my obligations and, as I learned much later, troubles of her own that I never fully understood. What troubles? Mira asked. I do not know the full truth of it, only that by the time I finally managed to travel back toward Millhaven, seeking her out after far too long a silence, I learned she had already married and moved away, driven by hardships in her family that left little room for a young clerk's unfulfilled promises. I never saw her again after that. I never even learned where she had gone, only that she was gone, and that whatever future we might have built together had closed like a door neither of us held the key to any longer. Mira felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though she was not entirely certain whether they came from grief for a mother she now understood more deeply, or from something else entirely, some tangled mixture of confusion and sorrow that she could not yet fully separate into its individual threads. She never mentioned any of this, Mira said, not once. I always believed her life before my father was simple, unremarkable. I never imagined she carried something so heavy, all alone, for so many years. Grief has a way of teaching us silence, Edmund said quietly. Especially when speaking of it seems to serve no purpose other than reopening old wounds. I imagine she believed the same, that carrying this quietly protected you, and perhaps your father as well, from a truth that could offer little beyond pain. Mira wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to steady the emotions rising within her. And you, sir, why have you carried this same silence, all these years, without ever speaking of it to anyone until now? Edmund's expression grew distant, his eyes drifting once more toward the darkened window. For much the same reason, I suppose. A man in my position learns quickly that vulnerability is often used against him by those seeking advantage. I built a life of careful composure, burying whatever softness remained beneath layers of duty and discipline, until the memory of Ellen felt more like a closed chapter than an open wound. I told myself, for many years, that I had made peace with what was lost. And had you, Mira asked, made peace with it? Edmund was quiet for a long moment before answering, his voice softer now than she had ever heard it. I believed I had, until the night I heard you singing in that corridor. Your voice, Mira, carries the same warmth hers did, the same ability to fill a silent room with something far larger than the song itself. Hearing it again, after so many years, reminded me how little peace I had truly found, and how much of myself I had simply learned to hide rather than heal. The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy fog, neither of them speaking for a long moment, as the full shape of their shared history continued to take form between them. Mira found herself studying his face more closely now, searching for some resemblance to herself, some shared feature that might explain the strange pull she had felt toward him since that very first night, though she found nothing beyond his eyes, which held a depth of sorrow she recognized now as remarkably similar to her own. Sir, she said finally, her voice steadier now, though still trembling slightly at the edges. What does this mean? For either of us? I do not know how to hold this knowledge alongside everything I believed about my mother, about my own life, about how I came to find myself working in this very building, where you have spent so many years. Edmund considered her question carefully, his hands folding together in front of him, as though physically bracing himself for whatever he was about to say. I do not know what it means, Mira, not entirely, but I know I cannot pretend, now that I understand who you are, that our paths crossing in this building was mere coincidence. I believe some part of your mother's story led you here, whether either of you intended it or not, and I believe it would be wrong of me to ignore what that might mean for both our futures. What are you suggesting, sir? Only that we take time to understand this together, carefully, without rushing toward conclusions neither of us is prepared to face. I would like to know more of your mother's life, the years I missed, the woman she became after Millhaven, and I would like, if you are willing, to help ease whatever burdens remain upon your family. given the connection we have both just discovered. Mira hesitated, uncertain how to respond to such an offer, aware of how quickly rumors could spread through a building like this one, and how dangerous it could be for a cleaner to be seen receiving special favor from the head of the council, regardless of the reasons behind it. "I appreciate your kindness, sir," she said carefully, "but I must ask that we proceed with caution. My position here is fragile enough without drawing attention that could be misunderstood by others." Edmund nodded, respecting the wisdom behind her caution immediately. "You are right to be careful, and I admire you for recognizing it so clearly. We will proceed quietly then, and in time, perhaps a path will reveal itself that honors both your mother's memory and the life you are building now." Mira allowed herself, finally, a small measure of relief, though the evening's revelations continued to churn within her long after she left the library that night, walking home through streets grown suddenly unfamiliar despite having traveled them countless times before. Somewhere behind her, in the tall council building glowing faintly against the darkening sky, Edmund Hale remained seated at the library table, long after she had gone, staring once more at the small portrait he had carried with him, since retrieving it from his desk drawer earlier that day, seeing now, in its painted features, not only the woman he had lost, but the daughter she had left behind, standing at the very threshold of a future neither of them could yet fully imagine. News, no matter how carefully guarded, has a way of finding its own path through a building full of watchful eyes, and within days, whispers had begun circulating through the council halls about the unusual attention Edmund Hale had been paying to one of the cleaning staff. Margaret Voss, sharp as ever, was the first among the senior council members to notice the pattern clearly enough to raise the matter directly. She found Edmund alone, in his private chamber one afternoon, reviewing documents related to the ongoing trade negotiations, and closed the door firmly behind her before speaking. "There is talk among the staff," she said without preamble, "about your interest in one of the cleaners. A young woman from Ashwell, I am told." Edmund did not look up immediately from his papers, keeping his expression carefully neutral. "The building is full of talk, Margaret. Most of it means little. Perhaps, but this particular talk has reached the ears of several senior members, and I would rather understand the truth of it from you directly than allow rumor to shape the council's perception on its own." She lowered herself into the chair across from his desk, her sharp eyes studying him with the same scrutiny she applied to every difficult negotiation. "Is there truth to it, Edmund? Have you been showing favor to this young woman in ways that go beyond ordinary courtesy?" Edmund set his papers down slowly, weighing how much to reveal to a woman whose discretion he trusted more than most, though even her loyalty had its limits when the reputation of the council was at stake. "There is a personal matter involved, Margaret, one connected to my own past, long before either of us held our current positions. It is not a matter of impropriety, though I understand how it might appear otherwise from the outside. Explain it to me then, so that I might understand it properly rather than relying on second-hand gossip." Edmund considered for a long moment before deciding that Margaret, of all people, deserved the truth, given her long history of loyalty to the council's stability and her own discretion in matters requiring careful handling. He told her, briefly and without excessive detail, of his youth in Millhaven, of Ellen Bramwell, and of the recent discovery that the young cleaner working in this very building was, in fact, her daughter. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression unreadable throughout most of the explanation, though by the end a flicker of genuine sympathy had softened her usually stern features. "That is a heavy history to carry alone for so many years," she said finally. "I understand now why this discovery would affect you so deeply, but Edmund, you must understand the position this places you in, both personally and professionally. The council's reputation depends on the perception of fairness in all things. If it becomes known that you are showing particular favor to a member of the cleaning staff, regardless of the reasons behind it, certain factions within this council will use it against you, especially those already seeking any opportunity to challenge your leadership." "I am aware of the risk," Edmund said quietly. "I have tried to proceed with caution, though I confess, the matter has proven more difficult to navigate quietly than I anticipated." "Then perhaps it is time to consider a more open approach," Margaret suggested, surprising him slightly with the shift in her tone. "Secrecy tends to breed suspicion, Edmund, whereas honesty, presented properly, often disarms it. If this young woman truly is connected to your past in the way you describe, perhaps it would serve you both better to acknowledge it plainly, rather than allowing rumor to fill in the gaps with assumptions far worse than the truth itself. Edmund considered her words carefully, recognizing the wisdom in them even as he weighed the risks of exposing something so personal to the scrutiny of an entire council chamber. And if the council chooses to view this connection unfavorably, regardless of how honestly it is presented, then you will have at least removed the element of secrecy that fuels the worst kind of speculation, Margaret said. I cannot promise every member will respond with understanding, Edmund. Some will undoubtedly see opportunity in any perceived weakness. But you have led this council through more difficult negotiations than this. I have faith you can navigate this one as well, provided you approach it with the same careful strategy you apply to every other challenge. Edmund thanked her for her counsel, though the conversation left him with more to consider than he had anticipated when the day began. He spent the remainder of the afternoon turning her words over in his mind, weighing the risks of continued secrecy against the uncertain outcome of open acknowledgement, uncertain which path truly served Mira's well-being best, given how quickly rumors could spiral beyond anyone's control once released into a building already primed for gossip. That evening, as he walked the halls following the conclusion of the day's session, he encountered Mira herself, finishing her final rounds of the evening near the entrance hall, her cart loaded with the last of her supplies for the day. She noticed him approaching and straightened slightly, offering a small, tired smile that had grown more familiar between them over the past weeks. "Sir," she greeted him, "I did not expect to see you at this hour." "Nor I you," he replied, though this was not entirely true, since he had, in fact, timed his walk deliberately, in hopes of encountering her before she left for the evening. "Mira, I must speak with you about something important, though I fear it may complicate matters further, rather than simplify them." Her smile faded slightly, replaced by cautious concern. "What has happened, sir?" He explained, as gently as he could, the conversation he had shared with Margaret Voss, and the growing whispers circulating through the building, regarding his attention toward her. Mira listened with a tightening expression, her earlier fears about drawing unwanted attention, now confirmed in the worst possible way. "I told you I feared this," she said quietly, once he had finished. "My position here is already fragile, sir. If the council begins to view me as some kind of scandal, some source of embarrassment for you, I could lose everything, including the ability to support my father, who depends entirely on the wages I send home each month." "I understand your fear," Edmund said, "and I would never allow harm to come to your position, because of my own past decisions. But Margaret suggested that continued secrecy may serve us worse than honesty. That rumor left unchecked tends to grow far more damaging than truth acknowledged plainly." Mira considered this for a long moment, her hands gripping the handle of her cart tightly as she weighed the risks on either side. "And if the council chooses to see this connection unfavorably, sir, what becomes of me then?" Edmund met her eyes steadily, his voice carrying a quiet resolve she had not heard from him before. "Then I will ensure, whatever the council decides regarding my own reputation, that your position and your well-being remain protected. I owe your mother that much, Mira, and I have come to feel, over these past weeks, that I owe the same to you as well, regardless of how this matter ultimately resolves itself within these walls." Mira studied him carefully, searching his face for any sign of hesitation behind his promise, finding instead only the same steady resolve she had noticed in him since their very first true conversation in the private chamber weeks ago. Whatever uncertainty lay ahead, she realized, she would not face it entirely alone. And for the first time since arriving in this cold, impressive building, nearly a year ago, that realization offered her a small, fragile comfort she had not expected to find within these walls at all. The council chamber had never felt so large to Mira as it did the following week, when Edmund Hale requested her presence before the full assembly of senior members, a request that sent a wave of fear through her chest the moment Clara Whitfield delivered the message. "He wishes to speak with you before the council," Clara said, her weathered face creased with concern. "This is highly unusual, Mira. I have worked in this building 20 years, and I have never once seen a member of the cleaning staff called before the full assembly, except to answer for some serious wrongdoing." "I have done nothing wrong," Mira said, though her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "I do not doubt that," Clara replied gently. "But whatever this concerns, child, you must be prepared for anything. The council does not always deal kindly with matters it considers beneath its usual concerns, and there are those among its members who would relish any opportunity to embarrass Edmund Hale, regardless of the cost to you. Mira spent the remainder of that morning in a state of quiet dread, going through her usual duties, with hands that shook slightly more than usual, her mind racing through every possible outcome of whatever awaited her that afternoon. She had expected Edmund's promise to protect her, but she had not expected to be summoned so publicly, so formally, into a setting she had always understood to be entirely beyond the reach of someone in her position. When the appointed hour arrived, she was escorted into the great chamber by one of the council attendants, her simple work clothes feeling suddenly inadequate against the grandeur of the room, its high ceilings and long polished table lined with the same stern faces she had glimpsed only briefly during her cleaning duties, faces now all turned directly toward her, with varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion. Edmund stood at the head of the table, his expression composed in the same careful manner she had come to recognize, though she noticed a tension in his shoulders that suggested this moment weighed on him as heavily as it did on her. "Members of the council," he began, his voice carrying easily through the large chamber, "I have called this session to address a matter of personal history that has recently come to light. One I believe requires transparency, rather than continued speculation." Margaret Voss, seated near the center of the long table, gave a small nod of encouragement, though the other members remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "Many years ago, before I held any position within this council, I formed an attachment to a young woman named Ellen Bramwell, in a village called Millhaven, along the northern reaches of the river. Circumstances beyond either of our control separated us before that attachment could develop into a shared future. I have recently discovered that Ellen passed away some years ago, and that her daughter, Mira, now works within these very halls as a member of our cleaning staff." A murmur passed through the assembled council members, several exchanging glances that Mira could not fully interpret from where she stood near the entrance of the chamber, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to keep them from trembling. "I share this history," Edmund continued, "not because it bears any relevance to council business, but because I understand that rumors have already begun circulating regarding my recent attention toward this young woman, and I believe honesty serves this council far better than allowing suspicion to grow unchecked in the absence of clear explanation." One of the older council members, a stern-faced man named Peter Ainsley, leaned forward with an expression of open skepticism. "And what exactly is the nature of your continued attention toward her, Edmund, now that this history has been revealed? Surely you do not intend to extend her any special privilege within this building, based on a connection she herself played no part in creating?" "I intend only fairness," Edmund replied evenly. "I have not requested, nor will I request, any alteration to her duties or position, beyond what any member of the cleaning staff might reasonably receive. My interest in her well-being stems from a personal debt I feel toward her mother's memory, nothing more, and I wish this council to understand that clearly, rather than through the distorted lens of gossip." Peter Ainsley did not appear entirely satisfied, though he leaned back in his chair without further immediate challenge. Another member, a younger woman named Elise Farrow, spoke next, her tone more curious than accusatory. "Might we hear from the young woman herself? If this matter concerns her directly, it seems only fair she be given the opportunity to speak." All eyes turned toward Mira, and for a moment her throat felt too tight to produce any sound at all. She glanced briefly toward Edmund, who gave the smallest nod of encouragement, and she drew a steadying breath before stepping forward slightly, her voice quiet, but clear, when she finally spoke. "I did not know of this history until recently, when Sir Hale shared it with me directly," she said. "I have asked for nothing beyond what my position here already provides, and I have no wish to cause difficulty for the council, or for Sir Hale, through circumstances neither of us created. I only wish to continue my work honestly, and to support my father, who depends on the wages I earn here." Her words, simple and unguarded, seemed to shift something in the room's atmosphere, several of the harder expressions around the table softening slightly at the evident sincerity in her voice. Margaret Voss, watching closely, allowed herself a small, satisfied nod, recognizing in Mira's composure exactly the kind of honest dignity she had hoped might disarm the worst of the council's suspicions. "I have known Edmund Hale for many years," Margaret said, addressing the room directly. "I have never known him to act without careful consideration of consequence, nor to place personal sentiment above the well-being of this council. I believe his transparency here today demonstrates exactly the kind of integrity we should expect from our leadership, rather than grounds for suspicion. A few more questions followed, some pointed, others merely curious, but the overall tenor of the discussion gradually shifted away from accusation and towards something closer to cautious acceptance. By the time the session concluded, no formal action had been taken against either Edmund or Mira, though it was clear the matter would remain a subject of quiet discussion throughout the building for some time to come. As the council members filed out of the chamber, Edmund approached Mira, his expression carrying a mixture of relief and lingering concern. "Are you well?" he asked quietly, once the room had mostly emptied. "I am well, sir," she said, though her hands had not yet fully stopped trembling. "That was more difficult than I expected." "You handled it with more grace than I could have hoped for," Edmund said, a rare warmth entering his voice. "I am sorry to have placed you in such a position, though I believe, in time, this transparency will serve us both better than continued secrecy would have." Mira nodded, though her mind remained heavy with the weight of everything that had just transpired, uncertain what the coming days would bring, but grateful, at least, that the truth now stood plainly before the very council that held such power over both their futures. In the weeks that followed the council session, life within the building settled into a rhythm that felt, to Mira, both familiar and subtly transformed. She continued her duties as before, cleaning the same corridors and meeting rooms she had always tended, though she noticed a gradual shift in how certain members of the staff and council alike regarded her, a mixture of curiosity and, in some cases, newfound respect that had not existed before her history had come to light. Clara Whitfield, in particular, had grown warmer toward her since the session, often finding small excuses to check in during the day, offering quiet encouragement whenever she noticed Mira's confidence wavering under the weight of unfamiliar attention. "You handled yourself well, child," she said one afternoon, watching Mira polish the long table in the third meeting room. "I have seen seasoned council members falter under less scrutiny than what you faced that day." "I did not feel as steady as I must have appeared," Mira admitted. "My hands trembled the entire time." "Trembling hands and a steady voice," Clara said with a small smile. "That is often the truest measure of courage." Edmund, for his part, remained careful in how he approached Mira in the following weeks, mindful of Margaret Voss's warning about perception and impropriety, though the two found small, natural opportunities to continue their conversations, usually in quiet moments between his duties and hers. He told her more of her mother's youth in Millhaven, memories he had carried silently for over a decade, now finally given voice after so many years of careful burial. Mira, in turn, shared stories of her mother's later years in Ashwell, painting a fuller picture of the woman Edmund had loved and lost, a woman who had built a quiet, dignified life, despite the hardships that followed her departure from Millhaven. She spoke of the river often, Mira told him one evening, as they sat together in the library, following the end of her duties, a rare moment of unhurried conversation between them. Even far from Millhaven, she never lost her fondness for the sound of water moving over stone. "I used to think it was simply a fondness for nature, but now I understand it carried far more meaning than I ever realized." Edmund listened to these stories with a quiet, aching gratitude, each new detail helping to fill in the long years of silence that had separated him from Ellen's life after their parting. In turn, he found himself, for the first time in many years, speaking more openly about his own life, his own regrets, the careful walls he had built around himself in the years following his return from Millhaven, walls that Mira's presence, and her mother's memory carried within her, had slowly begun to soften. Their growing friendship did not go entirely without difficulty. Peter Ainsley, still skeptical of the entire matter, continued to raise quiet objections whenever the topic arose among the council members, questioning whether Edmund's judgment might be compromised by personal sentiment in matters of council business. Margaret Voss, however, remained a steady voice of support, reminding her colleagues repeatedly of the honesty Edmund had shown in bringing the matter before them, rather than allowing it to fester in secrecy. One afternoon, nearly a month after the council session, Edmund approached Mira with a proposal that surprised her far more than any of their previous conversations had. "I have been considering," he said carefully, as they walked together through the quiet garden behind the council building, "whether there might be a place for you within this building, beyond your current duties. Your voice, Mira, is a remarkable gift, one that has already moved this entire council in ways few could have anticipated. I wonder whether you might consider using it more formally, perhaps in ceremonies or gatherings the council hosts throughout the year." Mira stopped walking, turning to face him with an expression of genuine surprise. "Sir, I am a cleaner. I have no formal training in music beyond what my mother taught me as a child. Surely such a role would require skills I do not possess." "Talent, Mira, is not always measured by formal training," Edmund said gently. "I have heard many trained singers perform throughout my years in this position, and none of them have moved this council the way your simple, honest voice did on that first evening in the East Corridor. I believe you underestimate the gift you carry." Mira considered his words carefully, torn between the fear of overstepping a place she had long understood to be far beyond her reach, and a small, stubborn hope that had been growing within her since that very first night, a hope she had tried, for weeks, to keep carefully contained. "I would need to consider it carefully, sir," she said finally. "Such a change would carry its own risks, its own scrutiny from those who already view my position here with suspicion." "I understand," Edmund said. "Take whatever time you need. I only wished you to know the possibility exists, should you choose to pursue it." Mira spent the following days turning his proposal over in her mind, weighing the fear of failure and public scrutiny against the quiet longing she had carried for years to reclaim the part of herself she had left behind in Ashwell, the young woman who had once sung freely beneath the old oak tree, without fear of judgment or consequence. She spoke of it with Clara, who encouraged her gently but firmly to consider the opportunity seriously, reminding her that gifts left unused often grow quiet resentments of their own, festering silently in ways that eventually demand to be heard. She also wrote to her father, describing the strange turn her life had taken in recent weeks, though she softened certain details to avoid worrying him unnecessarily about the council's scrutiny. His reply, when it arrived nearly 2 weeks later, carried words that settled something within her more firmly than any council session ever could. "Your mother would want you to sing," he wrote, in his careful, aging handwriting. "She gave up much in her life for the sake of family and duty, and she never once complained of it, though I know she carried a quiet sorrow for the parts of herself left behind. Do not carry that same sorrow, Mira. If this council offers you a chance to sing freely, take it, and know that wherever her spirit rests, it rests easier knowing her daughter found her voice again." Mira read the letter several times over, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, before finally folding it carefully and placing it among her most treasured possessions. The following morning, she sought out Edmund before the start of her duties, finding him in his private chamber, reviewing the day's correspondence. "Sir," she said, standing straight despite the nervousness still fluttering in her chest, "I have considered your proposal, and I believe I am ready to accept it, whatever challenges it may bring." Edmund's careful composure broke, just slightly, into something resembling genuine joy, an expression Mira had rarely glimpsed from him in all their weeks of growing acquaintance. "I am glad, Mira, truly glad. I believe this council, and this building, are about to hear something they have long been missing, whether they knew it or not." The ceremony marking the conclusion of the Northern delegation's visit had always been a grand affair, held once every few years, whenever a major trade agreement reached its final signing, attended by council members, visiting dignitaries, and prominent citizens from across the region. This year, Edmund Hale had arranged for something entirely new to be added to the traditional proceedings, a decision that had sparked considerable discussion throughout the building in the days leading up to the event. Mira stood backstage in the great hall, her hands trembling slightly, as she smoothed the simple but elegant dress Clara Whitfield had helped her arrange for the occasion, borrowed from a seamstress who owed Clara a favor from years past. Through the heavy curtains separating the small preparation area from the main hall, she could hear the murmur of the gathering crowd, hundreds of voices blending together into a low hum of anticipation that made her stomach twist with nervousness. "You will do wonderfully," Clara said, adjusting a small flower pinned into Mira's hair. "Remember, child, you have already silenced this entire council once, without even trying. Tonight, you do it on purpose, knowing full well the gift you carry." "What if I falter?" Mira asked. "What if my voice fails me in front of so many people?" "Your voice has never failed you," Clara said firmly. "Not once. In all the months I have watched you work these halls. Trust it now, the same as you have every other day." A soft knock came at the door before Edmund stepped inside, dressed in his formal council attire, his expression carrying the same warmth that had grown steadily more familiar between them over recent weeks. "The delegation is seated," he said. "The council awaits. Are you ready?" Mira drew a steadying breath, meeting his eyes with a mixture of fear and determination. "As ready as I believe I will ever be, sir." "You need not call me sir any longer, Mira," he said gently. "Not after everything we have shared these past weeks." "Old habits," she said, offering a small, nervous smile. "Edmund, then." He extended his arm, an unconventional gesture given the formality of the occasion, though Mira understood the gesture for what it was, a quiet demonstration of solidarity, as she prepared to step into a role few in this building would have ever imagined for a young woman who had spent the past year cleaning their floors in careful silence. She walked with him to the edge of the great hall, where a small stage had been arranged near the head table, and as her name was announced to the assembled crowd, she felt her heart pounding harder than it ever had, even during the council session weeks earlier. But as she stepped forward into the light, scanning the sea of unfamiliar faces before her, her eyes found Edmund's steady gaze near the front of the gathering, and something within her settled, the same quiet strength her mother had carried through years of hardship rising now within her own chest. She began to sing, the same river song that had started this entire remarkable turn in her life, her voice rising clear and true through the great hall, filling every corner of the room with a warmth the cold marble had rarely known. The crowd, restless and murmuring only moments before, fell utterly silent, captivated by a voice that carried both simplicity and depth, an honesty that no formally trained performer could easily replicate. As the final notes faded into the hushed hall, a long moment of silence followed, before the room erupted into applause, council members and dignitaries alike rising from their seats, moved by a performance none of them had expected from a member of the building's own cleaning staff. Margaret Voss, seated near the front, wiped quietly at her eyes, while even Peter Ainsley, the most skeptical of Edmund's colleagues, offered a respectful nod of acknowledgement toward the stage. Mira stood amid the applause, tears gathering in her own eyes, overwhelmed by a moment she had never dared to imagine possible during her long months of quiet, invisible labor within these halls. She glanced toward Edmund, finding him watching her with an expression of open pride and quiet joy, the careful composure he wore so consistently in every other setting finally giving way, if only for this brief moment, to something unguarded and true. In the weeks that followed, Mira's life within the council building continued to transform, in ways she could hardly have anticipated. She was offered a formal position as a court singer, tasked with performing at official ceremonies and gatherings throughout the year, a role that came with its own modest but respectable wages that allowed her to send even greater support home to her father, whose health continued its slow but steady improvement under proper care. She did not abandon her connection to the cleaning staff entirely, choosing to maintain close friendships with Clara and the others who had supported her through the earliest, most uncertain days of her time in the building. Her new position, rather than separating her from those she had worked alongside, instead became a source of quiet pride throughout the entire staff, a reminder that talent and dignity could rise from even the humblest corners of a grand and powerful institution. Her relationship with Edmund continued to deepen as well, growing slowly and carefully under the watchful eyes of a council that had gradually come to accept, and even celebrate, the unusual history that had brought them together. Though questions remained about what their future might hold, both understood, without needing to speak it aloud, that whatever came next would be built honestly, without the secrecy and silence that had once separated Edmund from the woman he had loved and lost so many years before. On quiet evenings, when her duties concluded and the halls grew still once more, Mira would sometimes return to the east corridor, where it had all begun, standing near the same spot where she had once knelt with her cleaning cloth, singing softly to herself, with no expectation that anyone was listening at all. She would think of her mother, of the summer along the river that had shaped so much of her own life without her ever knowing it, and of the quiet courage it had taken to let her voice be heard again after so many months of careful silence. The council hall, once a place of cold stone and careful formality, had become something warmer for her now, a place where an entire assembly of powerful people had once gone still, listening to a simple song, sung by a woman they had never truly seen before that moment, and where one man, carrying a decade of buried sorrow, had finally allowed himself to feel something again, all because a young cleaner had dared, on one ordinary evening, to sing to herself while cleaning the floor.